Доброго ранку всім. Ми розпочинаємо роботу Українського кризового медіа-центру. Тема першого заходу – 5 років після Майдану. Чи є шанс?
Ladies and gentlemen, we start our briefing, the topic of which is 5 years after Maidan. Is there a chance for justice? Among our speakers, we have Mr. Volodymyr Bondarchuk, head of the NGO Families of Heavenly 100 Heroes, Oleksandra, Matviychuk, head of the board of the Center of Civil Liberties, Fiona, Frazer, head of the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, and also Cuanacháin, who is the Senior Director of the Office of the Secretary General of Amnesty International. My name is Oleksandra Matviychuk. I'm the head of the board of this Maidan SOS NGO. And it was established during those events, and our activists were working at that time 24 hours a day, and we dealt with many activists who disappeared, and the relatives of the people who were beaten and who participated in every way in these beatings and the events that were taking place in Maidan, the clashes, the skirmishes, and so on and so forth. We unfortunately have, regrettably, we have to point out that the upper echelon of the current Ukrainian authorities are not interested in the outcomes and in the results of the investigations regarding the people who suffered or even were killed, and the investigations of their murders have not yet been completed. There are a couple of categories of these hurdles, of these impediments to the investigations. The first one is the lack of necessary energy, vigor, if we may put it this way, by the Prosecutor General's office in their efforts to continue investigations. In the recent years, some of the criminal proceedings
підвищеному стані.
And the department that was in charge of those proceedings, of those events, they were restructured, reorganized a couple of times, and that impeded the efficient completion of the investigation. The second category of the impediments is the practically counteraction, we can say, resistance, if not anything else, by the law enforcement agencies of Ukraine, like the Security Service of Ukraine, the Interior Ministry officials. They do not pass the documents on time from one department to the other, and for example, the Prosecutor General's office had to subpoena some of these law enforcement agencies in order to get some documents of theirs needed for successful investigation. For example, very recently, Mr. Gorbatyuk mentioned that around a dozen people are in their positions. Some of those people have been implicated, as you know, in their reluctance to proceed more vigorously in these investigations. The third category of the impediments was that as a consequence of reorganization, the investigative department of the Interior Ministry was reorganized and restructured, and then the criminal cases are supposed to be transferred to the newly established national National Bureau of Investigations, I think, and so these lengthy proceedings and investigations, they are not. These are not the only shortcomings of the activities of the current law enforcement system of Ukraine. It's for example, the non-compliance with the law, which is in Ukraine is called Maskisho. It's named the abuses by the law enforcement agencies, like, for example, very forceful searches of premises and so on. They were called after one of the theater plays that was called Mask Show, or Show of the Masks. And the fourth category of the impediments is the impediments at the level of the judiciary system, where, for example, in the next stage of Maidan, the so-called Auto Maidan, when the owners of the automobiles demanded some changes, some breaks, tax breaks or something for the imports of the used cars from the neighboring countries. They were somehow harassed by the authorities, and the activists of these owners, they formed an association and started suing the government, and the judiciary system does not work effectively enough in order to proceed with these investigations either. I'm not going to go more into detail describing these impediments, these hurdles, but I will just conclude by saying that Ukraine is a country will not proceed successfully in its future, towards its better future, unless this page in its history is not folded. And I came to the conclusion that both the investigations, the judiciary hearings and proceedings in any format, including, for example, the establishment of the new specialized courts, that will not happen unless this page is not folded. Mr. Bondarchuk, the floor is yours. Ladies and gentlemen, today is the anniversary of the beginning of the Maidan skirmishes, and each year we hold, these commemorative meetings and discussions and debates. For example, among those with whom we deal, at least three people, the relatives of at least three people who were wounded and who perished in the course of these clashes at Maidan, they have not yet seen the results of the investigations. As we know, there have been 13 policemen killed and 17 activists also died as a result of the clashes at Maidan, the former October Revolution Square in Kiev. the situation with this, with all this matter of long investigations, we can say procrastinated investigations. We confront different, or we face different dimensions of these procrastinations, like, for example, the use of tear gas and some other chemical substances in the course of these clashes by both sides. And since 2016, when, for example, the use of chemical substances started to be investigated, the outcome is not yet at hand. Although we bought, for example, the microscopes for the organizations that conduct expert examination of evidence, material evidence in different law enforcement agencies.
Розслідування пов'язане з
But it hasn't helped yet. Also, the whole layer of problems is related to the lack of proper legislation in Ukraine that could facilitate these investigations. Also, better communication with the MPs would be helpful with the members of Parliament of Ukraine, members of Verkhovna Rada. We continue struggle, although in the course of the last years that have passed since Maidan events, 17 parents of those who participated in those clashes have already died because of their age. And we certainly insist that these events, wherever they led to, these tragic consequences, they do not continue to go unpunished. Especially as far as the heavy-handed, approach by the police led to the casualties, not only among the law enforcement officials themselves, but also among the activists and the participants of the manifestations. Because of these controversies, we can see that even in the members of the judiciary, the judges, they somehow, are not always straightforward in their approaches. They manipulate, in our view, some of the stages of court proceedings. Tomorrow, we hope that 60 to 70 family members of those who died during the events at Maidan, they are going to get together here in Kiev. We hope to meet them, and with their help, we hope that we would be able to address the High Qualification Commission that is in charge of selecting the judges for this new specialized court that's going to be created, established. And what we call the Heavenly 100, so the people who died during those clashes and protest actions at Maidan. I think that we need to continue their cause. Hello, I'm a lawyer protecting trying to defend the victims, so to say, or those who suffered as a result of those events at Maidan. We have been involved in this work for the last 5 years, and we hope that our today's press conference would help in bringing to a happy ending these investigations. Oleksandra was very thorough in her detailed description of the situation and the impediments that these investigations encounter. And So I'm not going to go into detail by describing all the procedural side of our work, what were the legal actions that we have undertaken. But we can use some facts to highlight the present situation. First of all, I would like to remind you that the head of the Department of Special Investigations, Mr. Gorbatyuk, turned to the court and with the purpose of initiating the proceedings against the head of the court, Mr. Bondarchuk, and this investigation regarding Mr. Bondarchuk has been initiated and is now proceeding for his inactivity in pursuing these investigations. And it's unprecedented when one high-ranking official of the law enforcement system sues another high-ranking official of that level, of that stature, in the judiciary and in the prosecutor general's system. And this is an example of how of the attitudes of the Prosecutor General's office towards these investigations and how justice is dispensed in general in Ukraine, or is exercised in Ukraine. I think it was in 2016 when one of the TV channels, I do not remember which one, demonstrated the documents that I gathered and that were proving that Minister of the Interior, Mr. Avakov, was not efficient enough in proceeding with the investigations of the events at Maidan. Today, it's no wonder that if nobody is surprised when he or she hears or sees it on TV that the journalists accuse the Minister of the Interior or the high-ranking officials of the Ministry of the Interior of inefficiency. And this situation is certainly very strange, and we even accuse the officials of the Interior Ministry of, obstructing justice and maybe even destroying documents and other proofs. So we are trying to prove that in the course of that investigation, some officials were trying to obstruct justice, which negatively affected the proceeding of the pursuit of these proceeding of those investigations. Speaking about the court system, the judiciary system, in the courts, the results of the investigations that are brought to the courts have not been investigated successfully, and we believe that in some cases, some of these criminal proceedings included even the episodes of, some mutual tortures and or tortures of those. Or against those participants of the clashes at Maidan, and although there are direct requirements of the criminal code and criminal procedure code of Ukraine for the uninterrupted nature of court proceedings, even though these requirements are violated, and the judges themselves, for example, those selected by this high qualification commission, some of the judges whom we accuse of some violations of the procedure, criminal procedure, they have been allowed to participate in the bid, in the contest for, in the course of which the judges of that new specialized court are to be, or could be, were supposed to be selected. And the head of that qualification commission objects when he hears these accusations that they are inefficient. He complains that there is the severe lack of judges in Ukraine, that a lot of vacancies remain unfilled. Therefore, we, by saying that, I'm trying to personalize, so to say, the responsibility in this case of the judiciary system inefficiency. What I would like to conclude with is that I want to say that 5 years has been a fairly long period of time, in the course of which, or during which, all these crimes and wrongdoings and misdemeanors and whatever type of violations of law, breaches of law, were committed at Maidan. They could have been, the investigations and prosecution of these violations could have been much better, much more efficient. We register the violation, the unpunished violations of human rights, those violations that were in breach of the Convention on Human Rights Convention, and we are continuing to work in order to establish specific facts of these violations, and we are going to try to stop manipulations by different officials of different stages of these investigations and proceedings. Ms. Fiona Frazer, the floor is yours.
Gentlemen, good morning to you all. As I think many of you know, I'm the head of the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. The Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine was deployed in 2014, and one of the key objectives that we were given to undertake was to work with the government, the authorities, on ensuring that there would be some accountability for the killings that took place during the Maidan protests. Linked to this was also the point of working with the government to try to address the systemic issues that were impacting on human rights protection here in Ukraine. So for the last 5 years, we have been closely monitoring developments with regard to the investigation and the attempts that have been made to try to ensure accountability for all those that were killed or died due to violent acts during the Maidan protests. Today, we are presenting to you a briefing note entitled Accountability for the Killings That Took Place during the Maidan protests. There you will find a number of our findings that we have been actually reiterating over the years, as well as some key recommendations. And I'm very grateful for the work that we've been able to do with civil society, with Mr. Bondarchuk, and with other members of the government of Ukraine. There is a news release, and you'll be able to see the numbers within it. According to our findings, 98 people were killed or died as a result of the violence in January and February 2014. This includes 84 protesters, 13 law enforcement officers, and one man who was present in the vicinity but who didn't actually participate in the protests. You've heard many references already to the delays in the investigations, to the interference within the court procedures. To date, only 3 people have been found guilty of incidents that led to the death of 2 protesters. The prosecution of 12 other alleged perpetrators, include officers of the police and State Security Service of Ukraine, is ongoing. Individual perpetrators, however, have not been established in the killings of 17 protesters and 13 law enforcement officers. Many impediments to the identification of suspects and prosecution of perpetrators have already been referred to by my colleagues on this panel. So I'm not going to go through the full list that we have in the briefing note, but I would like to highlight a few. First of all, during the protests, police officers were not wearing identification signs. Second, straight after the protests, more or less, many of the alleged perpetrators fled to the Russian Federation, becoming unreachable for Ukrainian justice. Third, as we've heard, there have been extensive delays in forensic examinations. And furthermore, as we've also heard, criminal proceedings and trials that are ongoing are marked with significant delays. We recognize that there are many challenges, but there are practical steps that can be taken by the government of Ukraine and should be taken in order to ensure that there is accountability for the killings that took place, justice for the victims. Our overall main recommendation, and we join what others have said, there is a need to speed up the investigations, to ensure that they are independent and impartial. Forensic examinations need to be done. More capacity, more budgetary resources need to be provided to the forensic bureaus. We need to see an end to the unreasonable delays and interference in the trials. The State Investigation Bureau will soon take over the investigation from the Special Investigative Department, as Oleksandra already said. It is critical when this happens that there is a smooth transition so that the investigations are not interrupted. This morning I was at an event in the Parliament with many here on the panel where we were with many of the families of the victims who died or were killed. And I want to reiterate our main message that we said there, and we will reiterate throughout the day. Every life matters. Every death needs to be investigated. All families of the victims have a right to truth and to justice. Thank you.
Pane O'Cuanacháin.
Thank you. And it's been a really important and humbling experience to sit here with such an influential panel and voices from families, lawyers, the UN and national organisations, and from Amnesty International, an international organisation. I want to add our voice here today. It's important that we recognise that some progress has certainly been made, and we've heard about that. But the main message today has to be the increasing alarm and concern about the ongoing delays in terms of investigations and justice and truth in relation to the deaths, the beatings, the injuries which took place here 5 years ago. There is increasing concern that the evidence, the information, the testimonies that are so vital to seeking truth and justice will not be available any longer with the passage of time. There's increasing concern that the justice and reparations that are owed to the families will not materialise. And it's so important that today we use this opportunity again to highlight those concerns and to call on the authorities to ensure that there are full and urgent investigations, that those who were involved in these crimes are brought to justice, to ensure that there's reparations and recognition for the victims and the families. It's very important that we recognise these events again today, not just because we have to stand with the families and with the victims, we have to stand for truth and for justice, but also it's really important that we recognise that this culture of impunity that we are seeing here, the denial, the failure to investigate, the failure to face up to human rights violations and to hold perpetrators to account, that impunity begets an ongoing climate where violence and violent hate crimes can continue in the Ukraine. And it's not just with a rearward-looking view that we're here today, looking for truth and justice for the Heavenly Hundred and those who were lost and those who were injured, but looking forward. In 2018, we saw a sharp spike in terms of activities by violent groups, hate-inspired attacks, and the same lack of any political commitment to investigate those crimes is the problem we're speaking about here today. And looking forward into 2019, we're going to see again, inspiring activists, civil society leaders, journalists, independent thinkers and academics standing up for truth and for justice here. And what we need to see is a climate where those voices, where those activists are allowed to speak out, are enabled, are given freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and that the climate of impunity ends. So I would like to close on that note and say that Ukraine is seen as a hugely important country in the world. For Amnesty International and our millions of members around the world, it's a hugely important country. We will not forget the victims of Maidan. We will not forget the families. We will not forget those who've been injured. We will be back here again next year and year after year after year in this very important space, in this very important country, demanding justice, demanding truth. We won't go away. We won't forget. And in a country that's now at a crossroads, you have a brave and growing and flourishing civil society. I'm meeting activists, human rights defenders, leaders who can bring such optimism and such hope for the future of Ukraine that I think there's a real moment now, if the political will is there, to allow these people to contribute their voice to a stronger and a more just and a more open and fairer future for Ukraine. Thank you.
І наразі у нас є трохи часу для запитань. Прохання бути лаконічними, піднімати руку та представлятися.
You have an opportunity to ask questions, but please introduce yourself. I would like to, you mentioned the fact that the high-ranking representatives of Ukrainian authorities, of Ukrainian government, had very lax attitude towards these investigations. I have been watching them for the last 4 years, and the attitude of Mr. Lutsenko, the Prosecutor General, seems to be very much in vain of your description. But whom would you mention specifically, whom would you name specifically among those high-ranking officials who are, so to say, failing these criminal investigations and or court proceedings? And how realistic are the successful completion, in your view, of these investigations and criminal proceedings in the courts? I would start, and I hope that we will be joined by our one of the prominent lawyers, Mr. Bondarchuk, and I would like to start by saying that any authorities, any people who, after presidential and parliamentary elections, would become the government of Ukraine, we will not let them destroy these investigations. I'm not sure how soon could we reach success in completing these investigations, whether it will be on our watch or maybe some other people who would come later after us, maybe they would see to it that these investigations are completed. The alternative is the ascension of a fascist, of a Nazi junta in this country, and we hope that not only us but also the other people who would come after us, having seen the documents and evidence of the events at Maidan, would understand what really happened there. So for us, as for a society, for us as for a people, justice here is important. And let me announce now that at the website Automaidan Source, we are going to download today the report on the investigation, on the progress of the investigation of the breaches of law during the events of Maidan. This report is quite candid, quite frank, and all the names that you asked about could be found there. We had an opportunity to communicate with the Prosecutor General, and we asked him what was the reason that the prosecution, the investigation, some investigations were impeded, and we asked him about some specific investigations, and he said it was my personal decision with regard to some to an investigation. And as far as the Security Service of Ukraine is concerned, the position of the leaders of the Security Service of Ukraine is understandable. They tried to protect their own personnel, some of whom were also shooting during those events at Maidan. They were using their firearms. Speaking about the Security Service of Ukraine branch at Khmelnytsk, the town of Khmelnytsky in Ukraine, their involvement and things related to their activities and inactivity is quite evident, or has been quite evident. And I would probably add by saying, add to what I have already said, that the Prosecutor General's office has not heard, not a single time, heard any of the criminal cases related to Maidan. And Mr. Gorbatyuk was not once summoned by the Prosecutor General, and they have never discussed these procrastinations, let's put it this way, in these investigations. And if there are any written reports and addresses invoking these impediments, these procrastinations, Mr. Gorbachev responded by turning to the court. And that's as far as the specific names are concerned. There could also be Prosecutor General's deputies, mentioned two of them, who, according to their professional functions, are supposed to observe, to follow these investigations at Maidan events. And among them, one of them, in fact, was that official against whom Mr. Gorbachev initiated, filed a complaint or initiated a case in court, practically. So this Department of Special Investigations was not effective in coordinating the activities of its regional branches, like, for example, that killing in front of the building of Khmelnytsk Security Service office. Its lax investigation is a good example of that very poor efficiency and practically it proves that the local security service offices are quite incapable of investigating these serious crimes effectively. And Mr. Stoliarchuk did his best, and that's what Mr. Gorbachev complained about. With the documents, Mr. Stoliarchuk, the sentence remained unfinished. Mr. Stoliarchuk was replaced by Ms. Stryjewska, Angela Stryjewska, and that person seems quite interesting, quite peculiar to me. She is quietly violating, the efforts, Mr. Gorbachuk's efforts to, with his in his criminal proceedings, and so these could be the three key names. That we to whom we could bring your attention, and we hope that Stoliarchuk and Stryjewska they could be made like Mr. Pshonka, for example, the previous Prosecutor General, the subjects, or the objects rather, of these, efforts to make more efficient these investigations.